Welcome to our next video, which looks at what happened between the Old and the New Testaments, often called the Intertestamental Period. This is part of our Bible reading plan with Anthem Church, and today's video comes from a discussion I led a few years ago, and I edited it to give you the essential background to better understand how this period of time shapes the way that we read the Gospels and the New Testament letters. So let's get started. And so first we'll look at some historical background between the end of Malachi and then leading into the Gospels. And so we looked at this timeline last time, and you'll see Malachi, Zechariah, and Haggai in blue. Those are the final Old Testament minor prophets, Malachi being the last words of the Old Testament. And so historically, these last prophets mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, they all lived at the end of the 70-year Babylonian exile and into the beginning of the Persian occupation. And so under the Persians, the intertestamental period that you see there in red, that's when that began. And they call it a 400 years of silence when God was not speaking. So that just adds some tension as we go into the Gospels. Now, during this intertestamental period, what's important to understand is that Alexander the Great, he established the Greek Empire. You can see some of his travels there on the map. He covered much of, from Macedonia all the way to Asia or India. And so this spread their Greek culture throughout the known world by an emphasis on trade, establishing colonies. And because Greek became the language of the people, later the New Testament authors wrote their accounts in Greek. And so that became a very significant influence in the New Testament for us, which is in the original language of Greek. And so when Alexander died, the empire disintegrated into four parts, and unfortunately Israel was sandwiched between two of the divisions of Syria and Egypt. And so both empires were vying for taxes from Israel, and the Jews became victim of rivalry. Now, this led into Antiochus IV of Syria. When he came into power, he replaced the Jewish high priest with Jason, and Jason started really making Jerusalem into a Greek city. Those opposed were called Hasidians, or pious people, which later developed into the conservative religious groups that we're going to read about, including the Pharisees. Also the Essenes that we don't as much read about, but we'll talk about them in a bit. But when Antiochus IV replaced Jason with someone who did not belong to the priestly line, the pious Jews resented the selling of their most sacred office to the highest bidder. And Antiochus got more difficult for the Jews. He eventually outlawed Judaism, enforced paganism. He destroyed much of Jerusalem and even defiled the temple. So this culminated in what's called the Maccabean Revolt. This is the Jewish response. They defeated the Syrians, established the Jewish Hasmonean kingdom, and triggered an internal kingdom that the Jews were really in conflict with each other about the Hellenistic syncretism. And so how much of the Jewish identity was eroding away by just the emphasis on Greek culture, and then just the Greek philosophies as well. And so that really shapes what triggered these religious groups that I wanted to highlight. These are groups that we're going to read about, that we've been reading about in the Gospels. And so the political intrigues of the Hasmonean rulers alienated the anti-Hellenistic Pharisees and Essenes, and it established the Hellenistic group called the Sadducees. The Sadducees were aristocratic supporters of the Hasmonean rulers, and so it just started to create a lot of tension. We read about that tension in the Gospels. Now, the Essenes we didn't read about as much. They were led by a high priestly leadership, whom they thought were to be the descendants of the legitimate high priestly lineage. And that's who the Hasmoneans ousted by assuming the new role as a priest king. So there's just a lot of conflict going between these groups. Now, the Pharisees, depending on their time, they could be a political party, a social movement, a school of thought among the Jews. And that started after the Second Temple with Ezra until present. And Herod established his temple that was a rebuilding. during this time. But the Pharisees were a strong group, and one of the factors that distinguished their belief was that all the Jews had to observe the purity laws that were in the Old Testament, the ceremonial laws, even those outside the temple. And so the Pharisees were considered the most expert and accurate expositors of Jewish law, and they were admired for their extreme adherence to the law amidst the Hellenistic pressures. Now, during the Hasmonean period, the Sadducees and the Pharisees acted as opposing political parties. We read about them a considerable amount. We will. And they argued over this priest-king role of the Hasmonean rulers. And this division created continual conflict within the Jewish people. It culminated in a civil war that ended in 63 BC when the Romans captured Jerusalem and inaugurated the Roman period of Jerusalem or Jewish history. That's where we come into the Gospels. Now, as we begin reading the New Testament, Rome is the dominant power, and Israel is a puppet state led by King Herod the Great. We read about him. He's a descendant of Esau, and so we read about Esau in the Old Testament back with Abraham. So that's his lineage. Now, furthermore, the high priests and authority are no longer from the line of Aaron, but they're hired into office. So that changed a lot of their understanding of the role of their leadership. It was more driven by political patronage. It wasn't driven by the ways that it was established in the Old Testament. Now, the temple is still the new center, or is still the center of Jewish worship. And you see that picture of Herod's temple on the bottom. That was being built in this time. At the same time, because of the exile, synagogues have sprung up in every Jewish city and were becoming a new center of Jewish life, even more than the temple. So we see a lot of Jesus teaching in the synagogue. That was kind of a place for the Jews to gather together, centered on the Torah, the Old Testament. Now, overall, the Jews are ready for deliverance. They're still waiting for the Messiah, and you really can sense the struggle that they're facing to rebuild their lives. So that's a bit of the historical background that's shaping that intertestamental period leading to the Gospels. What